Tomasz Waga thought he was living a normal life in Manchester, but one wrong choice would plunge him into the deadly world of the Albanian Mafia. From betrayal to fear, his story is a chilling journey into a criminal empire where trust can be fatal and survival is never guaranteed. Please subscribe for daily gang crime story and watch till end. Tomasz Waga had always seemed like an ordinary man to anyone who saw him on the streets of Manchester. He ran a small business, kept to a daily routine, and was polite to neighbors and colleagues. But appearances were deceiving. Beneath the calm exterior, Tomasz had begun to dabble in circles far darker than he had ever imagined. He owed small favors to people whose names carried weight in the underworld, unaware that every favor and every transaction was slowly binding him to a dangerous web. The Albanian Mafia, known across Europe for its ruthless methods, had been watching him for months. Tomasz's business dealings, once innocuous, had attracted their attention, and in the world of organized crime, being noticed was rarely a blessing. It started subtly. A stranger would appear near his office at odd hours, always lingering for just a moment before disappearing into the shadows. Small packages he ordered online went missing, only to turn up days later in ways that made him uneasy. His phone sometimes buzzed with messages from unknown numbers, empty texts that made him feel watched. Tomasz tried to shrug these signs off, telling himself that stress from work and city life was playing tricks on him. Yet deep down, he felt the tension growing around him like an invisible chain tightening slowly. Tomasz had always prided himself on handling problems on his own. He was careful, methodical, and had a sharp mind for business. But the world of the Albanian Mafia was something entirely different. Their reputation preceded them. Stories of sudden disappearances, shocking brutality, and warnings carved into the lives of those who crossed them circulated quietly among locals. Tomasz had heard whispers of their operations in the docks, warehouses, and underground nightclubs, but he never thought their attention would turn toward someone like him. Despite his careful nature, Tomasz made a crucial mistake. He trusted people who were not to be trusted. A casual conversation, a shared secret, a handshake in the wrong company. It was enough for his name to be whispered to the very people who would eventually orchestrate his downfall. Within the Mafia, any sign of weakness or hesitation was an opportunity to assert control. Tomasz was about to learn that in their world, trust was a dangerous luxury, and missteps were fatal. As days passed, the tension became almost unbearable. Every time Tomasz walked through the streets, he felt eyes on him. Cars followed him too closely, and strangers seemed to appear wherever he went. His intuition screamed that something was coming, yet he couldn't pinpoint the exact danger. It was a shadow that lurked just beyond his understanding, a threat he could neither confront nor escape. Little did he know, these were only the opening moves in a game he was already losing. The Albanian Mafia was patient, methodical, and merciless. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and Tomasz's ordinary life was about to be shattered forever. Tomasz Waga had begun to notice cracks in his world, but he still didn't realize how deep the danger ran. What he thought were minor problems, missed deliveries, strange phone calls, lingering strangers, were only the first signs of betrayal. He had trusted people he considered friends, allies who had promised support during difficult times. But one of those friends had quietly turned against him, feeding information to the Albanian Mafia. Every deal Tomasz made, every contact he met, was now being observed and reported to a network of ruthless criminals who thrived on manipulation and fear. The web around him tightened without warning. Small favors he had once offered, favors he thought harmless, became evidence of debts that could never be repaid. Tomasz's routine meetings with suppliers and partners were scrutinized. His home, which had always been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Letters left at his door were opened before he could read them. Packages were tampered with, and people he trusted smiled at him with hidden intentions. He had unknowingly walked into a trap, laid by those he had considered loyal. The very network he relied on for support was quietly dismantling his life. Tomasz tried to piece together what was happening. He noticed subtle changes in behavior, a glance that lingered too long, an offhand comment that seemed loaded with hidden meaning. The betrayal was not loud or overt. It was calculated, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Every step Tomasz took seemed to lead him further into the hands of the Albanian Mafia. He had underestimated their patience and cunning, believing that cleverness and caution could keep him safe. In reality, the gang had already studied his patterns, learned his weaknesses, and waited for the right moment to act. The betrayal cut deeper because it came from someone he had trusted completely. A man who had once shared meals and conversations with Tomasz had been secretly observing, taking notes, and recording every move. The Albanian Mafia relied on this kind of inside information to maintain their dominance. They knew that fear was most effective when it came unexpectedly, when it emerged from the shadows rather than in a direct confrontation. Tomasz's world, which had seemed stable and predictable, now felt foreign and hostile. As the days passed, the Mafia's influence over his life became undeniable. Threats were no longer hidden in cryptic gestures. They began to manifest in ways impossible to ignore. Tomasz noticed cars parked outside for hours, unfamiliar faces loitering near his office, and deliveries that were suddenly intercepted or delayed. Even his closest allies grew distant, carefully avoiding involvement in anything that might draw the Mafia's attention. It was clear that Tomasz was being isolated, surrounded by people who would not and could not protect him. In this phase of his life, Tomasz realized he was alone in a dangerous world he barely understood. Every familiar face could be a spy, every friendly gesture a warning. The Albanian Mafia had infiltrated his life completely, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. The betrayal he had ignored or dismissed was now undeniable, and the consequences of trust misplaced were about to escalate. Tomasz's ordinary life had been replaced with a daily fear that something catastrophic was waiting just around the corner. The game had begun, and he was already deep inside a trap from which escape seemed impossible. Tomasz Waga could no longer ignore the feeling that danger was closing in. Small incidents that he had once dismissed now seemed deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly precise. His daily life, once predictable, had become a maze of uncertainty. Every street corner, every shop, every familiar path seemed suspicious. Cars followed him too closely. Shadows moved in corners where there should have been none, and strangers lingered in places where they had no reason to be. The sense of being watched was constant, a tight grip on his chest that never loosened. Even inside his own home, Tomasz began to feel vulnerable. Packages arrived torn open, notes appeared on his desk that he didn't leave, and the security system he had trusted now seemed inadequate. He tried to rationalize each incident, telling himself it was coincidence, paranoia, or minor theft, but deep down he knew better. The Albanian Mafia had a methodical way of letting their targets know they were being observed before taking the next step. Every warning, subtle or overt, was meant to weaken resolve and instill fear. Tomasz could sense it in the calculated timing of each intrusion, the way events seemed to spiral in patterns he could not control. Tomasz's instincts screamed at him to act, to leave, or to protect himself, but he had nowhere to run. Friends who might have helped were either already compromised or too afraid to intervene. His business contacts kept their distance, unwilling to risk entanglement with the Mafia. The walls of his once safe life were closing in, and the shadows that had lingered at the edge of his vision now felt suffocating. The danger was no longer abstract. It was tangible, something he could almost touch in the ominous quiet of his apartment. In the way, cars idled just a little too long outside his building, in the eyes of strangers that lingered a moment too long. Even small routines became exercises in caution. Tomasz noticed patterns. A delivery truck always passing at the same time, a man in a dark jacket appearing on his road to work, a stranger's reflection in the window when he thought he was alone. Each sign was a piece of a larger puzzle he couldn't yet see in full, but the warning was unmistakable. The Albanian Mafia did not act randomly. Every step was calculated, every signal intentional, and every target had been studied before being struck. Tomasz understood that the warnings were not meant to intimidate alone. They were meant to prepare him, like a cruel rehearsal before the inevitable. Tomasz tried to prepare himself mentally for what might come, but fear had a way of eroding even the strongest will. The shadows seemed to follow him into every part of his life, turning familiar streets into corridors of menace, familiar faces into potential threats. Each night he lay awake, listening for sounds that might indicate danger, aware that any moment could bring confrontation. The tension was exhausting, yet he could not escape it. The Mafia's presence had become a silent force, moving through his life with invisible hands, shaping his reality and leaving him trapped in a world where every step, every glance, every decision carried deadly weight. By the end of this period, Tomasz realized that the warnings were more than just threats. They were promises. Promises of violence, promises of retribution, and promises of a final reckoning from which there would be no return. The Albanian Mafia had signaled their arrival with precision, and Tomasz Waga could no longer ignore it. The next move would be theirs, and he was entirely at their mercy. The night Tomasz Waga's life changed forever was cold and rainy, the streets slick with water that reflected the dim glow of streetlights. He had stayed later than usual at his office, trying to focus on work and ignore the growing dread that had followed him for weeks. Each step toward his car felt heavier, each sound on the wet pavement louder, as if the city itself were warning him. But nothing could have prepared him for the sudden violence that struck without hesitation. As Tomasz reached his car, a van emerged from the shadows, engine humming quietly, its presence unnoticed until it was too late. Masked figures moved with precise coordination, cutting off any chance of escape. Tomasz barely had time to react before he was grabbed, forced into the vehicle, and bound so tightly that struggling felt useless. Panic surged, but he quickly realized that fear alone would not save him. The van drove off at a controlled speed, turning familiar streets into a disorienting blur, leaving him trapped and isolated. Inside the van, Tomasz's mind raced. He knew the Albanian Mafia's reputation for brutality, yet he could not imagine the specifics of what was to come. The kidnappers spoke in low, calm tones, their actions deliberate and measured, leaving no room for negotiation or delay. Every movement, every gesture, was part of a plan that had been carefully executed. The fear that Tomasz had tried to push aside in previous weeks became tangible, pressing against him like a heavy weight as the reality of his situation set in. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time felt distorted in the dimly lit van before the vehicle finally stopped. Tomasz was led into a large, deserted warehouse, the doors closing behind him with a sound that echoed through the empty space. The building smelled of oil and dust, the air heavy with the sense of isolation. He realized that his previous attempts to understand the Mafia's warnings had been useless. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He was completely at the mercy of a group that thrived on fear, control, and meticulous planning. The Albanian Mafia made no effort to disguise their power. They surrounded Tomasz with a presence that was oppressive, an unspoken message that resistance was not an option. Every detail of the warehouse, from the dim lighting to the careful placement of crates and equipment, was designed to intimidate. It was a controlled environment, each element reinforcing the fact that Tomasz had no allies left, no escape routes, and no chance to bargain. The sense of inevitability weighed on him. As the hours stretched on, Tomasz's mind raced through every mistake, every trust misplaced, every minor favor that had led him here. He understood that the kidnapping was not just an act of anger. It was a calculated message, a demonstration of power meant to instill fear, not only in him, but in anyone who dared cross the Albanian Mafia. The realization left him feeling powerless and exposed. The men who had taken him showed no mercy, their patience only heightening the terror. Tomasz Waga, once a man in control of his own life, was now trapped in a nightmare from which the end seemed inescapable, waiting for the final act that would change everything. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Tomasz Waga could feel the weight of every second pressing down on him, each one a reminder of the precariousness of his situation. The masked figures moved silently, their presence overwhelming, communicating without words through gestures and glances. Every detail had been planned, every step executed with precision. Tomasz realized that his fate was no longer in his hands. The Albanian Mafia was known for its ruthless efficiency, and Tomasz was about to witness it firsthand. They did not act out of mere anger or revenge. Their methods were deliberate, designed to send a message far beyond a single victim. Tomasz had become a symbol, a lesson to anyone who might consider crossing the gang. The men around him exuded control and menace, their movements slow but intentional, creating an oppressive tension that left no room for hope. Tomasz's mind raced as he tried to find any possible escape, any small opening he could exploit, but there was none. The warehouse, once an ordinary building, now felt like a cage meticulously designed to trap him. Crates and industrial equipment formed barriers. Shadows concealed the true number of captors, and every sound echoed with a sinister clarity. His heart pounded with the realization that resistance was futile, that the years of careful planning, calculated risk, and trust in his instincts had led him here to the mercy of one of the most feared criminal organizations in Europe. Then the process began. Tomasz's captors moved with chilling precision, their actions methodical, almost ritualistic. Every step of the assault was executed without hesitation. The Albanian Mafia had perfected their approach over decades, ensuring that their victims understood both the immediacy of their power and the futility of defiance. Tomasz's fear escalated, consuming him, as he realized the enormity of what was unfolding. Each moment was carefully controlled, each action reinforcing the inevitability of the outcome. The brutality was swift and unrelenting. Tomasz felt the physical force of the Mafia's methods, but even more terrifying was the psychological domination. They wanted him to understand that his life, and the lives of those who might oppose them, were subject to their absolute control. Every movement, every gesture of Tomasz's captors communicated authority, dominance, and a total lack of mercy. He was confronted not just with the threat of death, but with the realization that his individuality, his past efforts, and his attempts to navigate the criminal underworld with caution meant nothing here. As the violence concluded, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the act itself. The Albanian Mafia left a message embedded in the brutality. Crossing them, defying them, or even attracting their attention carried a cost that no one could escape. Tomasz Waga's murder was more than punishment. It was a warning, a stark declaration that in the shadows of the UK's criminal underworld, power was absolute, and survival depended not on courage or cleverness, but on obedience. The warehouse, once filled with calculated chaos, now stood as a grim monument to the cost of underestimating those who thrive in the darkness. And Tomasz's fate became a chilling example for anyone who might follow in his footsteps. Tomasz Waga's disappearance sent ripples through Manchester, sparking fear, rumors, and unanswered questions. Friends and family were left in shock, desperate for answers. But the Albanian Mafia had ensured that the trail went cold almost immediately. The warehouse where Tomasz met his fate was abandoned, scrubbed of evidence, and hidden from prying eyes. The gang had moved with such precision that even the most determined investigators found themselves blocked at every turn. It became clear that Tomasz had crossed forces far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The investigation was slow and fraught with obstacles. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, fearful of the repercussions. Those who might have had knowledge of Tomasz's movements or his connections hesitated, knowing that even the smallest hint could draw the Mafia's wrath. The police worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of information from security cameras, phone records, and interviews, but the Albanian Mafia's influence stretched wide. Every lead seemed to vanish, every clue dissipated, leaving a trail colder than the streets of Manchester in winter. In the aftermath, the underworld itself shifted. Tomasz's murder became a warning that resonated beyond the immediate circle of criminals. Those who had once thought themselves untouchable now reconsidered their positions. Alliances were reevaluated, and caution became the order of the day. Tomasz Waga had become more than a victim. He had become a symbol of the danger of crossing a gang that thrived on fear, control, and strategic brutality. The story of his life and death spread quietly through the city, whispered in pubs, markets, and back alleys, leaving a chilling impression on anyone connected to the criminal world. For Tomasz's family, the pain was unbearable. The loss of a loved one under such violent circumstances left scars that no time could heal. Every unanswered question, every moment without closure, deepened the anguish. Friends who had once admired his resilience were forced to confront the harsh reality that even the strongest, most careful individuals could fall victim to forces beyond comprehension. Grief and fear intertwined, leaving Tomasz's circle trapped in a shadow cast long before his disappearance. Yet the Albanian Mafia's message was clear and enduring. Their reach, their ruthlessness, and their ability to operate with near impunity made them a force that could not be ignored. Tomasz Waga's fate illustrated the harsh realities of the criminal underworld. Trust was fragile, loyalty was conditional, and one misstep could be fatal. His murder was not only a punishment, but a calculated statement to anyone who might underestimate the consequences of involvement with those who live in the shadows. In the quiet streets of Manchester, the echoes of Tomasz's story lingered. The investigation may have stalled, and justice may have seemed distant, but the fear it instilled remained tangible. Tomasz Waga's life, his choices, and his ultimate demise became a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk where power, violence, and secrecy intersect. In the end, his story was a chilling testament to the brutal reality of the Albanian Mafia in a world where one wrong move could cost everything, and where the shadows always carried the weight of consequences too heavy to escape.